thousands of Americans are taking to the streets to protest about racism, many for the first time in their lives. Why most Americans support the protests. George Floyd isn't the primary African American whose death in police custody sparked protests. There were also rallies and involves change after Tamir Rice, Michael Brown, and Eric Garner were killed by police. But this point seems different, with the response more sustained and widespread. There are demonstrations across the U.S., altogether 50 states and D.C., including in cities and rural communities that are predominantly white. Local governments, sports, and businesses appear readier to require a stand this point, most notably with the Minneapolis Council pledging to dismantle the local department. And the Black Lives Matter protests this point seem more racially diverse, with larger numbers of white protesters, and protesters from other ethnicities, standing with black activists. Beyond the scenes of protest and resistance playing call at cities across the country, a movement of a special sort has taken hold. The American public's views on the pervasiveness of racism have taken a tough leftward turn over the past few years. Never before within the history of recent polling have Americans expressed such widespread agreement that racism plays a task in policing and in society at large. Driven by the Black Lives Matter movement, this shift has primed the country for a replacement groundswell, one that has quickly earned the sympathy of most Americans, polling shows. As a result, in but fortnight, it's already forced local governments and national politicians to form tangible policy commitments. In a Monmouth University poll released in the week, 76% of USA citizens, including 71% of white race, called racism and discrimination a big problem within the U.S. That's a 26 percentage point spike since 2015. Within the poll, 57% of USA citizens said demonstrators' anger was fully justified, and another 21% called it somewhat justified. In the Monmouth poll, and in another released in the week by CBS News, exactly 57% of USA citizens said cops were generally more likely to treat black people unfairly than to mistreat white race. In both surveys, about half white race said so. This was a drastic change, particularly for white Americans, who haven't historically said they believed that black people continued to face pervasive discrimination. There's definitely been a seismic shift within the country, said Steve Phillips, a civil rights lawyer and political analyst who founded the advocacy group Democracy in Color. He pointed to what may seemed like a radical demand just a couple of years ago, cutting funding for police departments and redirecting it towards social services, and noted that it's now been openly embraced by some mayors and police chiefs, in cities including LA. I was interested to ascertain how that might play itself out, and now they're doing it, it's actually happening, Mr. Phillips said. Also in the week, lawmakers in Washington have pushed to finish a program that sends military equipment to local police departments, and House Democrats have vowed to unveil a sweeping police reform bill by next week. On the campaign trail, Joseph R. Biden Jr. on Tuesday said that if elected president, he would immediately found out a National Police Oversight Commission. Implicit and explicit bias. In 2009, the year President Barack Obama took office, just 36% of white Americans said the country needed to try to do more to make sure that black people gained equal rights, consistent with a Pew Research Facility poll. By 2017, 4 years after the beginning of the Black Lives Matter movement, that number had leapt to 54% of white race and roughly 3 in 5 Americans overall. 61% of the country therein poll said it supported Black Lives Matter. While polls can tell us only what people say they believe and will therefore be suffering from a respondent's desire to sound correctness, a 2018 study by 2 social psychologists determined that even people's implicit attitudes had shifted during the Black Lives Matter movement. That study asked over 1 million digital participants to quickly associate a series of faces, some black and a few white, with a series of words. The researchers found that in and after the protests, people were less likely to right away associate black people's images with negative words, or to quickly tie white race to positive ones. Anup Gampa, a social psychologist at Harvey Mudd College in California and one among the authors of the study, said the shift in attitudes had occurred among people of all ages, and among conservatives also as liberals. Based on our findings, I wouldn't be surprised if these protests have moved even white conservative attitudes to be more pro-black or anti-racist, he said in an interview, pertaining to the recent demonstrations. A youth crusade with broad appeal. The current round of protests is youth-led, then too, to a point, is that the shift in nationwide sentiment. Millennials and members of Generation Z are much more likely to mention they believe the police are susceptible to racist behavior. And consistent with a PBS/NPR/Marist College poll last year, members of these generations were quite twice as likely to support reparations for slavery, compared with baby boomers et.al. in older generations. A Pew survey in 2018 also found a stark generational divide over whether NFL players were right to kneel in protest of racial inequality. Among millennials and teenagers in Generation Z, quite 3 in 5 expressed approval of the protests. Among baby boomers and other older Americans, an equally large share said they disapproved. Similar trends play out specifically among young Black people and people of color, who express a greater desire for sweeping change, and a more unanimous suspicion of the police. During a recent Washington Post/Ipsos poll of African Americans, among respondents 35 and under, 9 out of 10 said they didn't trust the police to treat people of all races equally above in the other age bracket. The Trump effect. In this week's Monmouth poll, most Americans continued to precise a minimum of some level of satisfaction with their local police departments. Still, the poll reflected a replacement willingness across generations to mention that the police tend to point out racial bias. A similar trend has occurred over the past few years with reference to Immigration and Customs Enforcement, the agency liable for enforcing the country's immigration laws. It's become the smallest amount popular agency, consistent with data from the Pew Research Facility. In a March poll, Americans were even as likely to disapprove of the agency as they were to approve. Of the opposite 9 agencies Pew asked about, none had but 60% approval. Long before he declared himself your law and order president in the week, essentially positioning himself against the protesters, President Trump had put support for enforcement at the middle of his political identity. Within the process, he has often singled out ICE for praise. In this case, as in numerous others, Mr. Trump's combative brand of politics tends to draw clear dividing lines. Whether you support him will usually coincide fairly cleanly together with your stance on any number of issues. Yet throughout his presidency, he has commanded a minority coalition. That's certainly true now, together with his approval rating stuck within the low 40s. As he embraces harsh tactics against protesters, and seeks to label many of these fighting for racial justice as domestic terrorists, he has helped force a commitment, a method, or the opposite. And for the instant, an outsized and growing majority appears to be choosing the opposite side. The Public Religion Research Institute was within the midst of a nationwide poll last week when the primary protests broke out over George Floyd's killing. The group's researchers found that as demonstrations ramped up, Mr. Trump's favorability rating fell significantly among certain key voting groups. In the first 3 days of the poll, May 26 to 28, 40% of political independents expressed a positive view of the president. In interviews conducted over the 3 days that followed starting on May 29, when Mr. Trump tweeted, "When the looting starts, the shooting starts," his approval among independents dropped to 30%. Among white Christians, the dip was 11 points. Among seniors, his rating fell especially hard, from 58% to 41%.